Morning. Uh, 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 oof, oof. Oh, yeah, it's sending me a message about my video being active, like I didn't know my video was being active. So, anyway, Russia, according to the latest report, is going from an entirely professional, that is, in Hearts of Iron 4 terms, entirely voluntary, as in volunteers only army, to a second lightest conscription level, which is some conscription. That means they aren't likely to force someone at gunpoint, in that they likely aren't going to show up with recruiters, gunpoints, and orders to go to the front, but rather strong encouragement, etc., for reservists specifically, that is, people who have some amount of interaction with the army, going for recruitment into the military. So, extensive conscription would, in my view, be one where refusal is similar to what refusal in Ukraine does, which is, if you refuse to serve, you'll probably end up getting shot in under current days Ukraine rule. At least they won't allow men to flee the country, so their conscription levels are significantly higher than Russia's. So at least there's that. But Russia is moving from, according to the rumors that I have heard, from light from volunteers only to light conscription. In Hoi terms, this should roughly double their manpower, but due to the fact that their military doesn't have as much gear on the front line as they'd want to, they need to modernize and refit old equipment to be suitable for the front. But considering that I wonder if this is recording my audio, because that isn't moving. But considering that they are roughly looking at a doubling of their army manpower, they are most likely to move the reservists that do sign up for military service when pressed, but not at gunpoint, to the often unused front lines like Kuril Islands and Armenia and such, where they will mostly undergo training to be ready in 3 to 6 months, while forces in these fronts are most likely to be moved to not Kiev, but Ukraine. So, according to Binkov, which is not the most accurate form of military information available, but it does get a fairly high score for me. Some of the technical analysis of the ability of different, like airframes, for example, is wrong, but generally his analysis are more accurate than, say, CBS or NBC or whatever alphabet soup you're watching. He gets a pretty higher score, and his analysis was that his analysis was that the Russians have lost somewhere on the order of 20 to 40,000 in wounds and desertions and fatalities, and moving the units from the Far East and Armenian theater, plus using mercenaries, will not boost them beyond their initial strength number, while the Ukrainian losses are somewhat lower due to the fact that they have defensive advantage. And their mobilization started earlier than the Russian mobilization, so they're a little bit ahead in it. So the Ukrainian army is currently becoming stronger day by day, while Russia's army is roughly decreasing in efficiency. But since the Russians are still able to move forward more than the Ukrainians are, the strategic mobility is still on the Russian side. The Battle of Kiev, to me, seemed like a light push on the capital on the off chance that it happens to fall, which it didn't, as was predicted, and to draw the defenders to the region around Kiev while they take the Novorossiya and the eastern parts of the Dnieper. But now that the Battle of Kiev is over, it might take the Ukrainians a few days to redeploy to the front in east, while the Russians are getting most likely a larger part of their reserves committed to the eastern battle. And due to the fact that they're mostly using professional soldiers, while there are some reports of conscripts, they are rare for now. It seems that Belarusian intervention is unlikely because their standing army is so small that they would have to use reservists as well. And in the case of using reservists in this context, it does not bode well for the Russians because of similar country, ethnicity, and languages. So using reservists is not as, let's say, efficient as using professional armies. It does point like Russia is at least somewhat interested in reservists, which to me, due to the fact that Russia is already at a higher loss than Ukrainians, doesn't point to the fact that they'd be deployed to the front, because reservists at the front right now would cause the Russian losses to be even higher, which means that the reservists, in my analysis, are to an extent going to be deployed to the, I keep thinking Iraq war, but Ukrainian front. And there's some that's going to be deployed to the Ukrainian front, but most of them are going to be going to the areas where there are currently professional soldiers for deep training and mobilization of their armored and other components in anticipation for their professional soldier components being deployed to Ukraine. In Hearts of Iron 4 terms, if you are to look at this from that point of view, the Russians are going to be deploying units that have some equipment but is old, and some training but not sufficient, to the army groups in Armenia and the Far East, while they are selecting individual units from those front lines that do have good equipment and do have good training to be deployed to Ukraine. And then as the units that are deployed to those reserve areas start to get their trickle of equipment, because majority of the equipment is going to go to the Ukraine front, but some of it is going to go to the unneeded units in other fronts. And once those actually do get enough of the equipment to make a full unit with sufficient training, then they will be deployed to Ukraine, but it will take time. There are some units that will be deployed to the Ukrainian front, but according to the Russian current military strategy using reservists in Ukraine will push the fatality rate of the Russian soldiers higher than deploying those reservists for long extended training to the eastern parts of the country, where they will be getting equipment such as old tanks, which when the frontline units gets new tanks, their old equipment is going to be transferred eventually to these reserve units, and they will be given sufficient training to be effective in battle. But for now, they are not. But it is so unlikely that a country like Armenia or, for example, China would currently threaten Russia militarily. So units stationed in reserve in those areas can be deployed to Ukraine, but the border cannot be left empty because of things like corruption, tax avoidance, etc. So there needs to be some guys at the border. And keeping the current situation of higher economic inefficiency in Russia in mind, offering every reservist or person who has some military experience a sizable signing bonus, which the Russian war chest can actually afford in exchange for them being deployed to Ukraine instead of, say, Armenian peacekeeping, is possible. And a lot of people with the higher incentives for returning to service will actually, under the current circumstances, return to service. If Russia offers, say, 50% better wage than minimum service in Russia, or minimum wage in Russia, plus a signing bonus of, say, 6 months of service when you sign up for the military, then their manpower problems will vanish overnight. So Russia seems to be experiencing some level of manpower loss. Let's see if the audio actually works. His analysis was that so the sound actually works even though it's not showing here, which is weird. I'm going to show you the entire piece.
Haaveiletko uudesta keittiöstä? Kannattaa lisätä poweria haaveiluun. Toteuta keittiöunelmasi nyt poveri.
What?
When the Russian military started its attack, it did so with a projection of Ukraine's reaction that was hugely flawed. They certainly did not plan for Ukraine undertaking mass mobilization. So now, the Russian force finds itself outnumbered in Ukraine, with a fair chance the number will get even more lopsided. But before we talk about future numbers, operational losses in manpower must first be discussed. Those are going up daily. Estimating those is very hard, as both sides do not benefit from being truthful in that regard. High reported numbers might impact morale of either side. Besides, even with best effort, getting accurate tallies is unlikely given the chaos of war. Still, using available nuggets of information, one can try to guesstimate casualties. Both Russian and Ukrainian claims provide help. US intelligence data has also occasionally helped via estimates. Most recent Russian data on March 25th had figures of their dead and especially the wounded per day going down compared with Russian claims for the first week of the war. At the same time, Russian claims for the rate at which Ukraine was losing troops increased since the first week of the war, while Ukraine's claims suggest the rate at which they killed Russian soldiers dropped a bit. An extrapolated value between Russian and Ukrainian claims might look a little like this. The Ukrainian figure is higher due to high Russian claims. Whether that's actually true is debatable. It's also quite possible that Russia is admitting even fewer deaths among its own troops than Ukraine, which further skews the figure. During that time, we also had a NATO official offer their estimates. Given that and the US estimate extrapolated to March 25th, it seems more likely that the number of Russian troops dead had indeed reached 10,000 by said date. Fighting changed in the last week or so, with Russia not attacking as much, and Ukraine's forces going on more small-scale offensives. That may have led to a somewhat lower death rate for Russia and somewhat higher death rate for Ukraine. So the current day estimate as of early April may look like this, give or take a few thousand. But there's the captured too. Using Russian reports of dead to captured ratio and Ukrainian reports of captured Russians, it's still likely at least 1,000 Russian soldiers have been captured by now, and possibly even 1,500. As for the wounded, in World War II, roughly 50% of wounded did not return to battle, and even a fair chunk of those that did return sometimes took weeks or months to do so. If we again use the Russian published killed-to-wounded ratio, the 11,000 killed Russians might mean another 33,000 were wounded, of which over 16,000 are basically out of the war. So we get a total of some 39,000 Russian troops out of the battle, which is a lot. It's 21% of the Russian starting force. Given Ukraine's losses and higher troop numbers due to mass mobilization, the percentage of troops they lost is likely around 6%. Also, a large part of those Ukrainian losses are replaceable with new mobilized troops of similar training level, meaning reservists, while Russian losses have a higher percentage of professional soldiers, which are not as easily replaceable. The difference in casualties between two sides is to be expected when one side is
Those numbers on the right are very interesting. When Soviets had 210% more troops, they lost 64 and Germany lost 22.
trying to take territory.
While
A few times higher
Germans were
casualties
still
is usually
like
the case.
being
As
defeated.
historical example,
As you can see in Operation Bagration, when Soviets finally took the advantage of the situation in terms of losses. Before that, it was Germany's ball game, even if Russia or Soviets were advancing. Then at Bagration, the Soviets had 3 times more troops and finally crossed about 3 times more troops, finally crossed the so-called siege limit, where you have to have a certain amount of units before you can siege a city. The damage ratio shifted radically. So if you have not just numerical superiority, but somewhere along the lines of 3 times more than defenders, then you get this ratio. But if you just have more, but not to siege level more, then these are your losses.
will show. In Ukraine, the difference isn't as high, which can likely be explained by the difference in average training levels and massive difference in hardware. Let's also remember Ukraine is vast. It's bigger than France, not counting its overseas territories. It had over 40 million people before the war. Sure, at the very start of the war, Russian forces may have had more troops locally on some parts of the front, as Ukraine needed time to redeploy to the front. Around March 7th, the US reported basically all the Russian troops initially pre-deployed for the invasion have entered Ukraine. How many troops did Ukraine deploy by that point is a bit of a mystery. We do know that 2 days after the war started, Ukraine said it mobilized 50,000 reservists and another 50,000 troops of undisclosed origin, possibly volunteers. We also know that by March 6th, Ukraine said its reservist-based territorial army force hit 100,000, and that by March 15th, almost the entire planned force of 130,000 reservists reached their combat units. Further phase of mobilization has also started, where Ukraine is training troops without prior military experience. Allegedly, some 20,000 foreign fighters have enlisted in Ukraine's Foreign Legion unit, but really all those figures are very hard to verify. On one hand, Ukraine overstating its troop numbers may serve as a morale booster, or even deter the enemy. On the other hand, hiding actual numbers from the enemy also has clear advantages. Given that it's April already, it's possible Ukrainian numbers grew even more. But estimating a firm number is of course impossible. Subtracting troops that were killed or gravely wounded, however, paints an even grimmer picture for Russia. As said, whatever new Ukrainian troop numbers are being added now, they're lacking previous war or military experience. pool of such people has likely been exhausted, so the volunteers being drafted now need some weeks or months to become useful for anything that's not basic guard duty. That doesn't mean that even such a soldier may not have some effect. Training it's done more of its population, its numbers might eclipse Russian ones several-fold. Even just half as successful mobilization as the Soviet one might yield 350,000 additional troops to Ukraine come July of 2022. At the same time, it seems Russia is basically unable to seriously increase the number of its troops in Ukraine. That's because Russia is evidently fearful of sending its conscripts into battle. While a small number of conscripts did find themselves in Ukraine, they were an exception. After those revelations, Putin himself publicly proclaimed conscripts would not be sent into Ukraine. While at times it can be read that Russia has almost a million-man army, that's really misleading. Russia has an army, but also a navy, an air force, rocket forces, and so on. When it comes to actual ground troops, it has something like 360,000 troops, not the 900,000 troops, a number which includes the entire military. Furthermore, some 260,000 of those are conscripts. So if those indeed remain mostly off limits, then some 30% of those ground troops might actually be unavailable. Suddenly, those 360,000 potential troops shrink to 250,000. But that's not all. Russia can't afford to pull every single professional ground troop from every single corner of its country and send it to Ukraine. There's the Kaliningrad region, surrounded by NATO countries, which has always had several brigades worth of elite troops. There are ports and bases around St. Petersburg, the Russian North Fleet, Vladivostok in the east, disputed Kuril Islands near Japan, strategic Kamchatka bases, the permanent Russian detachment in Armenia, and so on. Those can't be all manned by conscripts, as Putin can't be completely sure the conflict won't grow bigger and perhaps involve NATO countries as well. It was reported that Russia is indeed pulling some troops from those areas, like the Far East and Armenia, but those aren't likely to be tens of thousands of troops. Some conscripts may replace them, but even so, 10 or even 20,000 additional professional troops would basically only be compensating for the losses in Ukraine so far. Foreign fighter numbers are unlikely to approach those fighting on the Ukrainian side, so they aren't a big factor.
Olipa kerran tarjouksessa maanantaista keskiviikkoon. Siskon makkara, euro 9.
Russia does count on some 35,000 local fighters from the Donbas region, but those aren't equipped nor trained to go on big offensives. Their contribution to front movements so far has been minimal. Sometimes the option of Belarusian army joining in is mentioned, but that may be more dangerous than it's worth. Just like Russia, Belarus is unlikely to send in conscripts. Without those, Belarusian assistance would be fairly minimal as its armed forces are heavily based on conscripts. Only a minor part of their army and likely most of their special operation forces could really be used in Ukraine, likely fewer than 10,000 troops. In the grand scheme of things, it would be a short shot in the arm for Russia, but nothing to change the course of the war. At the same time, Russia coercing Belarus into joining the war would be a serious escalation. It would be a third-party country joining in. Political repercussions of such a move might be far costlier than the military installations inside Ukraine. Political instability inside Belarus might be at stake as well, which is something Putin most definitely would not want to see. But for Russia to have some chance of continuing to push inside Ukraine under the present conditions, where arms aid is flowing into Ukraine and where morale issues are widespread within the Russian army, many more soldiers would be an absolute must. If Russia does decide to send in conscripts or even the National Guard, those would likely be kept back to keep securing the taken areas. But for that, the front line needs to fully consolidate without so many Ukrainian pockets of resistance. And still, the domestic political fallout of such a move might be deeply destabilizing. So far, Russia has not decided to go into that direction. It may thus be said that Russia seems unwilling to increase their numbers in Ukraine beyond the current 200 and something thousand. And even that number may not be sustainable if the war lasts for months and if conscripts and reservists remain off limits. Putin may be quite worried about sending in conscripts or proclaiming mobilization of reservists due to a possible public outcry within Russia if people that did not volunteer to fight start dying in numbers. If this whole war in Ukraine was a war where Russia itself was under attack, where the whole nation rose up like it did in 1941, then even millions might join the army to fight as fiercely as the Ukrainians are fighting now. But that's simply not the case. And for Ukraine, this war is what the Great Patriotic War was for the Soviet Union in 1941. It has to be said that numbers aren't everything. Even if Ukraine does have over 400,000 troops right now, roughly half of those are still very poorly trained and basically equipped with just rifles. They're light infantry with little means of motorization. While they can cause a significant headache due to their numbers in scenarios like urban fights, they're not as big of a factor in other scenarios, like stopping armored brigades rolling over the fields around cities to cut them off. But even that requires a consolidated and battle-ready Russian force. As we've already seen, Russia chose to retreat from the north of Ukraine. So the war seems to be going towards a more localized affair in the east and the south of the country. But it may also last longer. Over time, and with further troops and more weapons, Ukraine's army may try to pressure even those consolidated Russian positions in the east and the south.
You are about to experience the cage.
This should be copyright free, but nobody ever knows.
Ja sitten siirrytään Cage 38 vapaaottelutapahtuman ensimmäiseen otteluun. Saku Heikkola vastaan Andrei Selezov. 93 kiloa. Molemmat herrat painavat. Kohta katsotaan, kuinka Heikkola käy.
Same weight as me, but 10 centimeters. In fact, closer to 15 centimeters more height.
Tämän ottelun tarjoaa ravintola QQ. Ottelu käydään painoluokassa 93 kiloa ja ottelun kehätuomarina toimii Mikko Aaltonen. Ottelusta ensimmäinen tulee Venäjältä. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the blue corner, Andrei Selezov!
Ja sitten, hyvät naiset ja herrat, tervetuloa seuraamaan ensimmäistä ottelua Cage 38 ammattilaisvapaaottelutapahtumasta. Kehään on astumassa Andrei Selezov Pomin tasavallasta Venäjältä. Rekordi on 5 voittoa, 3 häviöä, 0 tasuria. Ja mitä odotat?
Ei mitään, Selezov on niin M1 sopimusottelija, niin kuin One Silvera tuossa aikaisemmin sanoi, ja on ihan virkistävää, että hän pääsee täältä ottelemaan, tai isosta venäläisestä kansainvälisestä organisaatiosta pääsee sitten tänne Suomeen ottelemaan vierailevana tähtenä, ja kyllä uskon, että hän on varsin vartautettava vastustaja Sakulle. Hyvä match-up, Jukka on tehnyt ihan hyvää duunia saadakseen järkättyä tällaisen ottelun pystyyn.
Ja siinä odotellaan, että Selezov nousee kehään. Vähän tarkistetaan herraa. Kuinka tärkeää tämä tsekkaushetki tässä on?
Se on tärkeä totta kai. Pääsääntöisesti siinä
Andrei Selezov!
Pääsääntöisesti ei mitään ongelmaa ole, vaan kyseessä on ennemminkin tällainen rutiinitarkastus, mutta totta kai joskus sieltä löytyy sitten vaseliinia tai muuta vääristä paikoista, liukastetta, ehkä jotain linimenttiä tai muuta, mikä sitten ei tietenkään häkkiin kuulu.
Selezov saa vastaansa tänään suomalaisottelija, joka tulee Valkeakoskelta. Hyvät naiset ja herrat, punaiseen kulmaukseen Saku Heikkola!
That game has a damn long loading time.
Ja sieltä paranti käyntiin Dropkick Murphys bändin biisi, joka saattelee Saku Heikkolan kehään. Valkeakosken Heraklesista 190 senttiä.
Deploy or redeploy the professionals from their other fronts to Ukraine and use the reservists in those areas to train to be professional
pienen icebreakerin
as well
askeleen
as
ensimmäisenä ottelijana yleisön eteen ja isot miehet kun lyö ja
using the reservists for rear guard duties so that their professionals can organize better along the front. But I don't know, I'm still kind of looking like Russia might win this one, but we'll see.
No totta kai niissä on aina oma glooriansa ja oma tunnelmansa, mutta kyllä nykypäivänä myös osataan kaikiksi onneksi arvostaa paljon myös pienempien painoluokkien ottelut, että niissä on taas omat asiansa, mitkä sitten siellä tekee ottelusta ja seuraamisesta mielekästä.
Jälleen Heikkolalle myös samat tarkastukset. Mies astelee kohta kehään ja on valmis. Tosi toimii. Rauhalliselta näyttää.
Rauhalliselta näyttää. Tässä vaiheessa ei enää ota paniikkinappulaa painaa.
Kaikki valmistelut on tehty, mitä on pitänyt tehdä.
Kaikki valmistelut on varmasti tehty. Ainahan ei onnistu ihan nappiin, mutta pääsääntöisesti tässä vaiheessa niitä ei enää tekemättömäksi saa. Eikä muutettua, että pään sisällä varmasti käy edelleen
Heikkala!
itsensä kanssa ja tämän tilanteen kanssa, mutta Saku on valmis.
Sinisessä kulmauksessa venäläisottelija, joka painoi eilisessä punnitustilaisuudessa 92,8 kiloa. Hänen ammattilaisotteluhistoriansa käsittää 5 voitettua ja 3 hävittyä ottelua. Ladies and gentlemen, fighting out the blue corner from Russia, Andrei Senasov! Punaisessa kulmauksessa valkeakoskelaisottelija, joka painoi eilisessä punnitustilaisuudessa 92,4 kiloa. Hän on ammattilaisurallaan voittanut 7 ja hävinnyt 6 ottelua. Hän edustaa Valkeakosken Heraklesta punaisessa kulmauksessa Saku Heikkala!
Ja sitten ottelu on valmiina alkamaan.
Ottelu on valmis alkamaan. Niin kuin sanoin äsken, se on tietysti ottelijasta aina riippuvainen, että millaisia ajatuksia just sillä hetkellä, kun sä häkkiin astut. Että toiset vielä sitä ehkä sotaa päässä käy, mutta yleensä siinä hetkessä unohtuu kaikki muu ja ottelu on valmis. Ottelu on valmis.
Saku has gotten slightly more in shape. No longer has quite a stomach bulge. He used to have a pretty noticeable bulge. He's gotten a little bit more in shape.
Erä alkaa. Siltä näyttää Heikkola aloitus.
Ai, siitä poimi heti takakäden suoraan Heikkola. Venäläinen Danonov löi hyvin ja lähtee aggressiivisesti kyllä liikkeelle. Tässä on ehkä nyt sitä ottelua, mitä Saku itse yleensä tykkää otella, niin kyllä vastaa Danonov kyllä varsin kovin tähän näin, että nyt pikkainen tilanne rauhoittuu, katsotaan minkä suuntaan ottelu kehittyy. Kova aloitus molemmilta.
Tässä varmaan tosiaan piilee se isojen miesten ottelemisessa se jännitys, että sitten kun ryskätään, niin ryskätään.
Kyllä siinä saattaa yksikin virhe kostautua hyvinkin nopeasti, että ei tuolla painolla, oi nyt osui Sakukin hyvin takakädellä. Kyllä tässä mitataan heti alusta asti, otetaan kyllä luuleja pois molemmilla puolilla. Oi ja sieltä sai hyvän polven, sai käännettyä häkkiä vastaan.
Sinne taisi tulla vähän
Saattoi, että tuli pikkasen siihen
off-limits-alueelle.
Off-limitsille vähän sinne rosvosektorille, vai miten sitä sanotaan, mutta se meni siihen rajoille ja toki tietysti tässä varmasti täytyy katsoa niin ottelija edustaa tilanne, että se meni sinne rajoille kyllä. Tuolla vatsaa se näytti ehkä pikkasen hipas sinne.
All my units are at regular experience. They used to be fully professional, but I've gotten larger units because I keep editing them and they still aren't at full. That's 3 brigades in 1 division with a signal company, and as soon as I get I already have like 11 on the experience. I'm gonna add a maintenance company. Here is that if you like build one of these, you can notice that it starts at green experience and slowly trains up and already has almost all of their units fully armed because I have a large reserve of infantry equipment and support equipment. So it guys don't have the full training yet very quickly and train in the field, but they get severe losses if they go into combat at that point. So deploying them to a front where they can safely train without risking the supply of the front line takes about a couple of months. So it depends on how much Russia actually has spare manpower. I think if they go to light reservist conscription, they'll have plenty of manpower, time will tell.
Hieman hidastumaan ja vähenemään. Aika kova ryskääminen varmasti alussa, niin siinä katsotaan nyt sitä, että kumpi sitten kestää tämän erän paremmin kestävyysominaisuuksilta. Selkeästi vaikuttaa siltä, että Saku ehkä on vähän tuoreempana ja venäläinen joutuu jäädyttää vähän ottelunsa, tulee yksittäisillä kovilla iskuilla, mutta Saku pikkasen jotain polvet notkahtaa siinä Sakuun. Kyllä tässä tää on hurja ensimmäinen erä kyllä. Hieno väistö, pudotus jalkoihin, mikä epäonnistuu kyllä sit loppuun pahasti. Mutta hyvin Saku sieltä nopealla reagoinnilla ei jäänyt sinne odottamaan, että venäläinen ottaa tiukan position, vaan lähti nousemaan ylös. On kyllä hurja ensimmäinen erä. Tässä on kyllä pään kestävyyttä mitattu puolin ja toinen. Saku jäi ikävästi nyt tuohon kilpikonna puolustukseen, eikä pääse oikein liikkeelle. Venäläinen tuolla toisen jalan huukilla hieman sitoo sieltä Sakun toista jalkaa ja Saku ei pääse nouseen ylös sieltä tällä hetkellä.
Nyt on ikävä paikka Heikkolalla.
Kyllä se on jo. Siitä koko ajan tulee korville lyöntejä ja Saku joutuu suojaamaan eikä pääse silloin taistelemaan täydellä teholla luonnollisesti siitä ylösnousemisesta, vaan joutuu suojaamaan itseensä tuossa niillä käsillään, millä pitäisi avittaa sitä ylösnousua. Dadonov otti tommosen half guard position nyt, sai Saku selälleen ja on toinen jalka Sakun jalkojen välissä niin sanotussa half guardissa. Saku tällä hetkellä keskittyy enemmän sitomaan kaveria, ettei satelisi iskuja sen enempää ja ehkä yrittää minuutin sitten selvitä tuolla alla ilman isompia vahinkoja.
Vajaa minuutti ottelua jäljellä ja ottelu ensimmäistä erää jäljellä. Hienosti pääsi pystyyn.
Sieltä Saku teki hyvän käännön, mutta nyt pikkasen voimat alkaa olla lopussa alasvientiä varten ja pahasti näyttää, ettei jäi sitten uudelleen alle.
Siellä on jokin paikka näyttää olevan auki jo.
Joo, kyllä siellä taitaa nokka jo pikkasen vuotaa jommalta kummalta. Painitilanteet on vaikeita silloin, kun maitohapot jyllää olkapäissä ja käsivarsissa ja veto on lopussa, niin se ei ole enää helppo kaataa kaveria maahan. Toki on se puolustajakin väsynyt, mutta Saku tässä nyt kovimman työn tällä hetkellä tekee.
Ja isoille miehillehän toi iskee ihan yllättäen toi maitohappo.
Kyllä se iskee joo. Hieno duuni Sakulta.
Trying my Central American Union against Russia, then I'm not really surprised that you're losing because I don't have even most of the Central American states.
Hyvä erän lopetus, hyvä kääntö.
Ensimmäinen erä taisteltu, kummalle antaisit ensimmäisen erän?
On kyllä tosi vaikea, mutta kyllä mä tämän antaisin kuitenkin Dadonoville. Hyvä erä, mutta kyllä tämä mun arvostelupapereissa kuitenkin Dadonoville menee.
Mikä oli Heikkolan vahvuuksia?
No Heikkolan vahvuuksia oli selkeästi se, että hän ei missään nimessä antanut periksi tätä ottelua ja osoitti, että haluaa taistella voitosta. Ja tässä ruvetaan oikeastaan nyt kysyä sitä. Ei enää kaverit on taidollisesti hyvin lähellä toisiaan. Et nyt kysytään sitten sitä, että kumpi enemmän ottelu haluaa voittaa ja kummalta löytyy tahtoa taistella loppuun asti.
Hyviä vastapalloja lyö, mutta joutuu liikkumaan niin nopeasti taaksepäin ton Andrein voimakkaan painamisen takia, että nyt vastapalloja ei oikein heittää. Niin nyt pitää toivoa, että Andrei väsähtää, mutta tää Sakukin on aika väsynyt tässä vaiheessa. Eikä väsytyspeliä, ei kannata lähteä.
Kiinni ja 3 miestä kehässä. Kohta mennään toiseen erään.
Mielenkiintoista nähdä, aloittaako venäläinen yhtä aggressiivisesti kuin aloitti ensimmäisen erän. Kyllä liike on ainakin selvästi hidastunut siitä ensimmäisen erän alusta. Enemmän seisovilla jaloilla ja ehkä sitten kyttää paikkaa enemmän tuollaisille koville yksittäisille osumille.
Eikä ole. Älä nyt huutele mitä sattuu nyt.
Niin kuin itse sanoit, niin huomattavasti on hidastunut. Nyt haetaan sellaista hyvää paikkaa, josta
Tähtäät niihin vastapalloihin ja pidät koko ajan sen ison alueen sen selän takana. Silloin tällöin voi ehkä tehdä hyökkäystä, mutta kannattaa pitää vastapalloa nyt.
Kehän tai häkin hallussa.
Yritä voittaa erä, mutta pelaa silti vastapalloa.
Jälleen kerran meni erogeenisille alueille.
Jälleen meni. Katsotaanpa hidastuksesta, miltä se tällä kertaa näyttää. Viimeksi taisi ottaa... Tässä ottelijalla on mahdollisuus siis pitää 5 minuuttia, jos tulee alasuojille isku, mutta...
Joo, toi oli ihan suoraan.
Suoraan sinne. Mutta ei venäläinen kauan ottanut tuota vehkeitä perutella